The bloodline is fracturing, and Jacob Fatu just made the biggest mistake of his career by going directly at Roman Reigns on Raw. But the real story? What happened next in that backstage area when the Usos found him? This is the confrontation that changes everything, and if you want to understand the future of WWE's most dominant faction, you need to subscribe to WWE Express and ring the notification bell right now so you don't miss our latest updates, because we're breaking down the psychology, the loyalty, and the brutal reality of what happens when you challenge the tribal chief. Let's dive in. Wrestling fans understand something that casual observers miss. The bloodline isn't just a stable. It's a family structure with real hierarchies, real power dynamics, and real consequences for stepping out of line. Roman Reigns has built an empire on absolute authority, but that authority only works if everyone accepts it. The moment someone questions it, the moment someone suggests that maybe Roman isn't untouchable, the entire foundation becomes vulnerable. Jacob Fatu confronting Roman Reigns on Raw isn't just a personal beef. It's a direct challenge to the established order of the most powerful faction in professional wrestling. Now let's talk about Jacob Fatu for a moment, because understanding his character is essential to understanding why this confrontation would be so significant. Jacob Fatu has been presented as a primal force of nature, a destroyer who operates on instinct and aggression. He's been positioned as someone who respects strength and dominance, but there's always been a question lurking in the background. Is Jacob fully committed to Roman's vision, or is he a free agent who simply aligns himself with power? That distinction matters enormously because it determines what happens next. If Jacob confronts Roman on Raw, he's making a statement. He's suggesting that maybe he doesn't need Roman's approval. Maybe he's tired of being positioned as Roman's enforcer rather than being allowed to pursue his own agenda. Maybe he sees an opportunity to rise higher within the faction, or maybe he's questioning Roman's leadership altogether. Whatever his motivation, the act of confrontation itself is an act of rebellion. And rebellion in the bloodline doesn't go unpunished. This is where the Usos enter the picture, and this is where the psychology gets really interesting. Jimmy and G.U.S.O. have been Roman's most loyal soldiers. They've been with him through multiple iterations of the bloodline. They've proven their loyalty time and time again. But more importantly, they understand their role. They understand that their status within the faction is directly tied to Roman's position. If Roman's authority is challenged, their authority is challenged. If Jacob is allowed to confront Roman without consequences, it sends a message to everyone else in the locker room that the tribal chief can be questioned, that his word isn't final, that the structure he's built is negotiable. The Usos wouldn't see this as personal conflict. They'd see it as a threat to the system that grants them power. That's why the response would be swift and overwhelming. When Jacob confronts Roman backstage after his challenge on Raw, the Usos would be there to remind him exactly where the line is. They'd be there to reinforce Roman's dominance through violence and force. It's not cruelty for its own sake. It's maintenance of order. It's sending a message not just to Jacob, but to anyone watching who might be thinking about testing Roman's authority. What makes this scenario narratively compelling is that it works on multiple levels. On the surface level, it's a physical confrontation. The Usos destroyed Jacob Fatu backstage, leaving him beaten and bruised as a reminder of what happens when you step out of line. That's the visceral, immediate story. But underneath that, there's character work. There's the question of what Jacob does next. Does he accept his place, humbled and reminded of the hierarchy? Does he grow bitter and resentful, potentially setting up future conflict? Does he try to retaliate, knowing full well that would be suicidal within the faction? There's also the question of Roman's involvement. Does he order the Usos to do this, or do they act autonomously, knowing it's what needs to happen? That distinction actually matters for understanding Roman's character. If he orders it, he's maintaining tight control. If the Usos act on their own, it suggests that they've internalized Roman's authority so completely that they don't need explicit instructions. They simply know what needs to be done and they do it. That's arguably more impressive from a leadership perspective. That's creating soldiers who are so aligned with your vision that they execute it without needing micromanagement. The other layer here is the question of whether this confrontation and its aftermath actually solve the problem or whether it creates new ones. Beating Jacob Fatu into submission might remind him of his place in the hierarchy, but it might also plant seeds of resentment that grow over time. In wrestling storytelling, every action has consequences. Violence that's meant to cement authority can sometimes backfire and create enemies from within. That's the tragedy of relying too heavily on force to maintain order. It works until it doesn't. Let's also consider what this says about the Usos as characters. They're not just loyal soldiers blindly following orders. They're intelligent, aware operators who understand the political landscape of the bloodline better than anyone. They know what Jacob's confrontation represents. They understand the threat level. And they're willing to do what's necessary to protect their position and their leader's authority. That's not mindless violence. That's calculated protection of their interests and their status. The brilliance of this scenario from a storytelling perspective is that it raises questions without necessarily answering them. Does Jacob Fatu respect the Usos after this? Does he blame Roman for ordering the attack, or does he understand that the Usos were acting in the faction's best interests? Does he learn his lesson and become an even more dedicated member of the bloodline, or does this create a permanent rift? These are the questions that drive long-term storytelling in professional wrestling. One moment of conflict spawns narrative possibilities that could sustain storylines for months. It also positions the Usos in a really interesting space. They're not just Roman's associates. They're enforcers. They're the ones who maintain order within the faction. They're the ones who remind people what happens when you challenge the structure. That's a distinct role with real dramatic weight. They become the physical manifestation of Roman's authority, the hands that execute his will. It elevates their importance within the faction while also potentially putting them in positions where their loyalty might be tested later. From a broader perspective, this scenario is fascinating because it illustrates why the bloodline has been such a compelling faction. It's not just about individual performers. It's about the dynamic between them. It's about power structures and loyalty and what happens when those structures are tested. It's about characters understanding their place in a hierarchy and acting accordingly, but also about the tension that creates. Will someone eventually decide that their ambitions outweigh their loyalty? Will the system eventually crack under the weight of its own authoritarianism? Those are the questions that keep audiences invested. What a backstage confrontation between Jacob Fatu and Roman Reigns, followed by the Usos' intervention, would really accomplish is deepening our understanding of the bloodline's internal dynamics. It would show us that loyalty isn't given freely within this faction. It's enforced. It's maintained through respect and through the implicit understanding that stepping out of line has consequences. That makes the bloodline scarier. That makes them more real. That transforms them from just a group of talented wrestlers into a functioning organization with rules and enforcement mechanisms. The wrestling business thrives on these moments where we see power structures in action, where we see characters operating within established systems and sometimes challenging those systems. It's what makes professional wrestling so compelling as a narrative medium. It's not just about wins and losses. It's about positioning, about hierarchy, about the unspoken rules that govern interactions between performers. If you've enjoyed analyzing this bloodline scenario and exploring the deeper psychology of wrestling factions with me, please subscribe to WWE Express for more detailed breakdowns of character dynamics, faction politics, and speculative storytelling that celebrates the artistry of professional wrestling. We're constantly exploring these kinds of narratives, diving deep into what makes wrestling characters compelling, and examining how factions operate as storytelling vehicles. You don't want to miss what we've got coming next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on WWE Express.